we're going to move on to our first fireside chat of the afternoon. It's going to be about 30 minutes. It's with, the topic first off is the future of ESG, a global outlook and lessons learned about impact. We have a visitor coming from Sydney, Australia. His name is Michael Traill. He's the Executive Director of For Purpose Investment Partners. Michael is an Australian leader and a global figure in impact investing. And we're very fortunate that he's come all the way from Australia here today to share from an Australian perspective and a global one about impact investing. Please welcome Michael to the stage. Michael, please join us up here. We also have our moderator, of course, Megan Lawson, the country manager of ERM in Vietnam. She'll be moderating today's fireside chat with Michael. I'll leave it to the two of you to get started. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back from lunch. Thank you for returning after lunch and spending some more time with us this afternoon. We have a power-packed 30-minute fireside chat ready for you. We hope to have a few minutes towards the end for questions, so this is your early warning to think of one. It is my absolute pleasure to be on the stage today. For those here who I haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, my name is Megan Lawson. I'm the country manager for ERM. ERM is a global sustainability consultancy, about 40 countries, 7,500 people, and I have the absolute privilege of leading our business here in Vietnam. If I haven't met you yet, but I should meet you, please come and introduce yourself later. Always keen to have conversations and expand the dialogue. We have here on the stage Michael Traill, and I have to say we have a pretty special opportunity to hear some perspectives from Michael, who is absolutely one of the business leaders when it comes to impact investment. He's had various different roles over decades. He is also a fellow Australian, so I apologise in advance for the fact that you have two Australian accents to cope with for the next 30 minutes. I'm just going to read a couple of sentences about Michael's background so that you really understand the perspective that he brings to share with us today. He has a range of primarily social purpose chair and board roles, including chair of the Paul Ramsay Foundation, which is Australia's largest foundation. He's executive director of For Purpose Investment Partners. He's a director of M.H. Carnegie and Company, board member of Australian Retirement Trust, which is Australia's largest superannuation fund worth $235 billion, part of the Hearts and Minds investment organisation, Catalyst Education, Australian Philanthropic Services, and he's an adjunct professor at the Centre for Social Impact at University of New South Wales, which coincidentally is also where I did my undergraduate degree. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks so much, Megan. Lovely to be here.
Yeah. So I just want to start by asking a really simple question. Just please share with us a little bit about your journey from what started perhaps in the early years as a fairly traditional investor and involved in investment to the more social impact and socially oriented investment that you're more involved with now.
Thank you, and happy to do that at the risk of indulging the audience in a sort of slight and brief scenic personal detour. There's a line from the Jesuits I always like, which says, show me the young person at 7 and I'll give you a predictive line of sight to what the adult does. So when I was 7, I grew up in country town Victoria, the southernmost state in Australia, a mall with a population of 17,000. It had its challenges. There was a very nice sense of community, but sadly, as a kid who grew up there in the 60s and 70s, now I'm showing my age, but if you looked at that community now, it shows up in the heat map of social disadvantage in Australia as a place that hasn't done particularly well. And so for my brother and I growing up there, we remember a couple of things. We remember a good sense of community, but we also remember, and we were at school with kids from families who had a lot of challenges, kids who you just knew were smart but didn't achieve their potential. And I think the opportunity we were given by parents who loved us, mum and dad really valued education. My father was the first in 4 generations to go past year 10 at school, and he was a high school teacher and principal. So the kind of, in one sense, the pathway out of Morwell, it was educational opportunities, very much in the footsteps from home. But what you saw and what you grew up with, literally our first home in Morwell, we were 100 metres from a brown coal mine, and if Mum would hang the washing up on the wrong day and the wind was blowing the wrong way, the washing would have to be redone. It wasn't a pretty environment to grow up with. I subsequently studied at Melbourne University. I did an MBA at Harvard. I had the privileged opportunity to join Macquarie Bank in the late 80s as, I think, employee number 380. Macquarie, as I think many in this room will know, is now a global investment banking behemoth with 16,000 staff. And I had the great opportunity in the early days to be part of building a pretty successful private equity business. But to get to your question, Meg, I left that when I was 41. My wife, who's with me today, would with some legitimacy say, darling, that was an early midlife crisis, and it probably was to an extent. But the point of that scenic detour is that I think who we are and how we grow up sits with us. And the existential question for me at that age was, having had an incredibly rewarding career personally, professionally and financially, was I go back to Morwell when I was in my 30s and 40s and see the fabric of that community had deteriorated, and yet I'm living in a country which has kind of top of the table OECD performance. So it kind of begged the question, with all of the great opportunities I'd been given educationally through home, through the care and love and educational values of my parents, was there anything that I could do in terms of the skills that I'd had the opportunity to develop through study and through Macquarie? So that was the itch that I was trying to scratch, and I wrote a book reflecting that journey and other things called Jumping Ship. So I jumped ship on February the 4th, 2002, which was the day before my 42nd birthday, and I jumped ship into the social purpose world.
Okay, fascinating. And if I can share a little bit also about my background. So I grew up and was born in a country town also in Australia called Broken Hill, best known for the home town of BHP. So I also come from, I guess, a place in Australia where we saw the impact that a company, a sector, the mining sector in fact, could have on a place. And my childhood memories are about driving from Broken Hill to Sydney and seeing the landscape. And so that's actually also what prompted and grew my commitment to sustainability and environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment, and making sense of the world in which we live, in which we have businesses, in which we grow up in and have families to raise for ourselves. And I think that underlying awareness of how the world works and being curious and being driven to find solutions to tough problems, is probably something that we all benefit from when we find ourselves working in, as an ESG professional in one way or another. Please talk to us a little bit about the idea of this Capital 2.0 and your vision of leveraging capital for social good and environmental impact in the world. And if I can challenge a little bit and ask for your thoughts, we can do good on social, ESG, on all fronts, but the commercial imperative is real. And for those of us sitting here and working and living in Vietnam, it's a real thing, and it matters significantly. So I'm interested in your thoughts a little bit about whether you see it as a trade-off, if you're shooting for ESG strength and performance versus commercial. How do you weigh these things up, and talk to us a little bit about that concept?
Yeah, I mean, and look, that's obviously the core question. And look, a couple of things. One is, let me just give a quick bit of context, because I think we're always shaped by the experiences we have and the observations around that. one of the things that I'd learned at business school and at Macquarie, it's about how do you mobilise capital, and I had the privileged opportunity to start in a very early stage venture capital private equity market in Australia, and it teaches you what to look for in terms of backing people and entrepreneurs. And what I learnt was if you could mobilise capital for entrepreneurs, they did well. There was like a sequence, evidence-based, where they could access capital at larger scale at lower cost. So if we invested in a company, did well, we'd make a 25 to 30% rate of return. They could access debt, they could publicly list. And when I jumped ship, one of the motivators was, how do we invest in social entrepreneurs? How do we mobilise capital with an evidence base? So the organisation I founded in 2002, Social Ventures, had at its heart two very simple things. One was, could we get people who've got experience in strategy in the business world, get them to think about mobilising capital and back not business but social entrepreneurs? And that journey informs my observations about what I think of as capitalism 2.0, which is fundamentally this, that we live in a world where there is the opportunity in a pretty significant set of investment opportunities to generate both appropriate financial returns and social impact. There's a spectrum. And I want to particularly in the comments on capitalism 2.0 focus on what I think is the evolving but significantly underdone opportunity for large-scale capital mobility. And I think listening to the panel sessions this morning, a lot of the core questions are, how do we mobilise big chunks of institutional capital to do that? But I think it's important to note there's a bunch of fabulous high-quality work in the philanthropic, early-stage social enterprise landscape where you just can't generate returns that would motivate an institutional investor. What I have seen, particularly in my role as a director and now investment committee chair of Australian Retirement Trust, we take ESG very seriously. Why do we do that? Frankly, it's not just moral, it's profoundly economic. As a $235 billion fund, we often ground our investment committee meetings in what I think of as our investment committee prayer, which is this. We're here to represent the best interests of 2.2 million members, average age mid to late 40s, average account balance $80,000 to $90,000. And we're there to protect and grow their savings to ensure that they have a high quality of life in retirement. You cannot do that unless you're taking a 15 to 20 year view. And the idea of connecting the consequences of climate change across a broad spread of social impact areas, doing that in a granular, thoughtful way as connected to decent risk-weighted returns, I just think is unarguable. And let me just give a quick practical example of what I think has shifted that's germane to the conversation this morning on climate change and the environment. When I joined the board 8 years ago, there would be investment proposals that would come to the board, often with not a lot of meat on the bones around the potential consequences of climate change or the likelihood of an implied carbon price. Now, it's impossible to consider a deal unless it's very explicit around that. And, the devil's advocate question is, well, Michael, that's just because there's a bunch of the debate's been fought and lost, the woke advocates of climate change and the Armageddon prophesiers have got to you. And my response is, well, A, the data's pretty compelling. B, from an economic point of view, if we're investing in assets that run the real risk of being stranded assets because the market's changing, because we're not looking explicitly at a carbon price, we've got our head in the sand. And I think that logic about the fusion of the economic and social and environmental impact is, if you take a 15 to 20 year view, as we have to as the custodians of the money for those 2.2 million people, I think you can draw obvious economic conclusions out of that. That's capitalism 2.0. It's happening at different speeds around the world, but I think there's an emerging knowledge that if you don't have those aligned sources of capital for those opportunities, we're missing something really important.
Absolutely, and I think for those of us in the room or project owners, those from lenders or the financial sector, we do have great international standards and benchmarks that help organisations understand how to apply good ESG practices. They're freely available, they're very well understood and out there, they're transparent, and we often try to promote awareness, build the capacity, build the sort of technical understanding of what good practice means, and it is increasingly shifting the perspective into the longer term. It's not 2, 3, 4 years horizon, it's 5, 10, 15, 20 years plus, especially, for example, with the Equator Principles and climate change risk assessment, human rights. Some of these tricky but super important topics to plan well for in order to protect the value of your investment and in order to make sure that your business is able to flourish in the way that you anticipated it should be, that can obviously build growth and wealth and opportunity. You mentioned there about sort of the ESG backlash. We heard this morning a couple of comments about greenwashing, and we've seen some parts of the world where there's a really strong kind of rebellion or scepticism. What are your thoughts?
Well, look, as I think I indicated in what I think of as the compelling case for capitalism 2.0, there's a ideological debate that's playing out around that that's very misplaced. I mean, I'm a creature of the pragmatic. If I put my investment committee hat on, I have a fiduciary responsibility to understand that the transactions put to me are appropriately risk-weighted. We can't accept massive trade-offs to do good. There has to be an economic foundation for that. And my belief at a very practical level is that there are a heap of opportunities that pass that risk-return muster that mainstream institutions have been slow, and I'm talking about this in an Australian context, been much slower to consider than I would have thought they should be. I do think, and it was interesting listening to the ambassador for Belgium, having been on a recent study tour of the major sovereign funds and offshore, the European funds, the EEC, Dutch pension funds have been really thoughtful and proactive in this. They're kind of world leading on that. And if you look at it at a global level, Australia, I think, is catching up. I think there's much more practical focus in our now $3.4 trillion pension superannuation market. US, frankly, scary. Just in terms of the polarisation that's existing politically around that. And the second point I'd make in relation to that, again, that came up strongly. Sarah Hooper set the scene for today by talking about the role of government as an enabler in this. And I think that's critical in an Australian context, and listening to the conversations around the opportunity set in Vietnam. Government's got a really critical role to play as an enabler of these transactions. If government can do sensible things that crowd in funding, that means there are institutional grade investment opportunities in those mission critical social environmental areas of the economy. That's a key part of that dynamic. And again, that's practical. If I see something, and I can give a quick practical example, there's a social housing deal we're looking at that can make a really significant impact on some really serious housing affordability issues in one of our major cities in Brisbane. There's a conversation with government about how government provides an appropriate level of reasonable insurance on what the key risk exposure is, which is development costs blowing out in a supply chain bottleneck environment in Australia. So we can accept a lower return on that if we know somebody's taking some reasonable risk elsewhere, which it's in the government's interest to do. And I just use that as a quick practical example of there's an obvious economic solution you can get to that aligns government, investors, and provides ethical change-making solutions that are of nation-building significance. So if you connect the dots with those three things, you change the country.
And I think the common interest perhaps that we all have in the room here, the nature of the conference and the roles that we each have, we are looking at ways to sort of impact the future that has national significance for Vietnam. That's the goal that we are trying to achieve, is to move faster, easier, more smoothly into a future Vietnam that is able to provide great livelihoods, better equity, better environmental outcomes, better infrastructure and so forth for decades ahead. You have a global perspective. You've had roles that have allowed you to understand sort of the way that these issues move globally. Do you have an example of either a success or a failure, perhaps somewhere in the world, that you could see that perhaps would be of relevance to the audience here today?
Yes, so one of the hats I was involved chairing an Australian Commonwealth Government Social Impact Investing Task Force, and we drew very heavily on the work that Sir Ron Cohen, who's a globally regarded impact investing figure in the UK. And Ronnie did that work 99-2000, but to me, it's a poster child of the things that were being picked up in the conversation this morning and what I just mentioned about government taking a really smart enabling role. He, for example, was instrumental in setting up a £400 million so-called wholesaler in the social space. What does that do? It attracted high-quality talent. It enabled a bunch of really quite impactful social impact funds to be set up, and the leverage of that, they've invested 600 million quid. It's crowded in probably another 3 to 4 times that amount of institutional funding. That's been change-making for that market, and we drew very heavily on those recommendations. And it's a great example, we think, of smart, thoughtful government policy, setting up something that is an enabling mechanism, getting talent, that big society capital, as it's called, drew talent with social compassion but deep business discipline. So big tick, great example. How do we repeat that? And Ronnie and Nick Hurd, who was the minister in the Cameron-era government who introduced that, are part of a global group, which I'm on the advisory group of, about how do you draw on global best practice to repeat that around the world. In the challenging basket, and you and I had a brief chat about this, I've watched with some alarm, and there's a risk that I've, given my private equity background at Macquarie, that I'm kind of get described as a poacher turned gamekeeper on this, but I do think I'm a bit of a cynic in some areas about what I think of as lipstick on an ESG pig in the reporting on a lot of funds who claim to be ESG, but when you scratch the surface and lift up the carpet, the gap between rhetoric and what's actually happening that's making an impact's pretty thin. So I think, that's a game that's bread and butter to you, I know, Meg. The integrity and authenticity of measurement is just so critical in this being done ethically and well. And so I think there's some movement that's required on that. There are a range of people. Ron Cohen, for example, has funded an initiative at Harvard called Impact Weighted Accounts, and that's really designed to provide and more explicitly measure some of the externalities of what publicly listed and private equity-owned businesses are doing. So I think there's an emerging art and science around that that'll hopefully change the dial. So they're the sort of two kind of good and could be improved observations that are key.
Yeah, and I think that the takeaway for me from those examples and some of the discussions that we've had, consistent with a lot of the discussions that we have with our clients actually, is that it's okay and it's necessary and it's super important to also look outside of Vietnam. So we need to balance the excellent opportunity and circumstances that we have within Vietnam that we know about the best, right? Because we're here, we understand it, we're in it. And marry that with the great examples, great benchmarks, success stories from elsewhere in the world, so that we don't have to repeat some of the pain points and challenges in other parts of the world. And I feel that it's really important to the ESG dialogue is that things are as transparent as possible, that we're able to share quite openly, because we don't want to have to relearn. If we can leapfrog towards a better solution faster, that's in all of our best interests, right? And there's great stuff happening in the world. There's certainly parts of the world that are moving super, super fast in the ESG space. We should be jumping on that. We should be learning from it. We should be bringing it and implementing it here in Vietnam as quickly and as efficiently as we possibly can, because we will get better outcomes, in my belief.
No, and just to that point, I mean, I'm embarrassed to say for Jen and I, it's the first time that we've had the chance to visit this, amazing and compelling country. And the platform here, just listening to the conversations this morning and the opportunities we've had to get a sense of the culture, there's an incredible entrepreneurial culture and dynamism. If you look at the stats, the platform of growth, I don't trivialise the challenges in terms of those trade-offs on an economics and impact, but the gift that you've got, which is, I think globally, that market has moved so much in the last decade. I spent most of the last 20 years of my life in that social impact measurement. And it's been transformed. There are so many compelling precedents, and Australia's a little island a long way away. I learnt very early when I jumped ship from Macquarie, just as I had at Macquarie, look at what is best practice elsewhere around the world. And the data points that you've got and the ease of access to talent through technology is astonishingly and transformationally different than it was 20 years ago. So, all of those things I think are an incredibly strong following wind, and from the people that I've had an opportunity to catch up with, the energy and the momentum around that is something that can really be seized, I think.
And that might be our final almost takeaway. But the energy in the country is phenomenal, right? The pace of change that's occurring here in Vietnam is very impressive. We have such a unique opportunity right now to influence sort of the future trajectory around really important topics. I think we're going to spend the rest of today and tomorrow talking about it. What would be your sort of final share to wrap up this fireside chat, but perhaps to leave all of us with a thought that we can, ponder on later and take some action on?
Well, I'll draw on, I gave a TEDx talk in 2014 which talked about the opportunity in Australia if you mobilise mainstream institutional capital, and even if that's only 2% of that total superannuation fund pool, that'd be $30 to $40 billion for hugely impactful social and environmental impact. So I'm unashamedly focused in that notion of capitalism 2.0. This is a country with a population of 100 million. The institutional pockets of capital, and some of them are represented here, the ability to tap those by aligning that appropriately risk-weighted financial return to drive that change, those investment opportunities, I think's really, really tangible. But in forums like this, what you want to make sure is you've got that voice, and this is not in any way to trivialise the incredibly important contribution of a range of philanthropic, smaller social enterprises, but that focus on having the voice of big capital in the room and being part of this, I think, is non-negotiable, and you can do it.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, let me pause there. I think we may have time for one brave questioner. If there is one in the room, now is your chance. Would anyone like to make a comment or ask a question for Michael? Dom?
Hello, Michael. Thank you again for coming here to join us today. My question is a simple one, I think. We have in the room today three governments which are partnering to deliver this conference today. What can we do as governments to deliver on that, to have those voices of big capital in the room and to make a difference?
I'll draw on the wisdom of Sir Ronnie Cohen, who's been a great mentor and guide in a lot of the work that I've had the opportunity to do. He says two things. One is easy, and I mentioned before, the other is potentially a bit more controversial and challenging. He said, Michael, if you're going to have an impact with this government task force, you really have to convince government that they have a hugely powerful role as enabler. That's language I've used before. They have capital. If they can do that, and if they can understand that they have the capacity to build markets, that can be transformational. But here's the confronting bit. He also said, Michael, whatever you do, make sure that the institutions that are set up are fiercely independent. If government thinks they can run these things, they cannot. They cannot. You need high-quality independent institutions which are capitalised by government, where there are people, and this is not in any way disrespectful of government, but recognise that if you're mobilising capital markets, you need people with skills who genuinely get the social impact and purpose, but have come from a world where they know about capital, they know about investment decisions. And I think that's something, you know, that I would close on, Meg. You know, my experience over the last 2 decades, and it was a lesson deeply drawn from the great opportunity to work at Macquarie over 15 years, where we invested close to $500 million in 42 companies, was that my mentors were people like David Clark, who was founding chair of the bank, Robin Crawford, who was the founding director, and their philosophy was really simple: get high quality, motivated people, give them rope and opportunity, and you'll end up being pleasantly surprised at what they can do. And that's what sits behind what Ronnie's entreaty to me was, and I just think that's so true.
And I think everybody here, we have the opportunity to do that in our own organisations, and we have the opportunity to do that wherever we have influence, to continue that conversation and just allow the environment to uplift itself to the potential that it can deliver. And if we do that from an ESG lens, in the broader sense, then it's going to be a very exciting future, and I think there's going to be many people who are super proud and pleased that they were part of it, as opposed to letting it happen around them. So perhaps I leave it there. Michael, thank you very much on behalf of everybody and the organisers. We're really grateful for the opportunity to have had some time.
Thank you.
Thank you.